The Duke of Ashford had a secret. Not the kind that gets whispered behind gloved hands at dinner parties. Not the kind that raises eyebrows over crystal glasses of sherry. His secret had hay on the floor, the smell of leather and horse, and no candles after midnight. It was 11:30 when Callum Ashford slipped out of his own drawing room. Behind him, the chandelier still blazed. His mother was still laughing at something Lord Pembridge had said. Lady Isabella was still seated at the pianoforte, her back perfectly straight, her fingers perfectly placed, playing a perfectly forgettable melody. Everything was perfect. That was the problem. He didn't take a lantern. He didn't need one. He'd walked this path so many times that his feet knew every loose stone, every soft patch of mud, every creak of the stable door. The cold air hit him the moment he stepped outside. November in Yorkshire had a particular kind of cruelty, not violent, just relentless. It pressed against your collar, crept under your cuffs, reminded you that no amount of silk or title kept a man warm if his house was hollow. And Callum's house was very hollow indeed. £47,000. That was the number his solicitor had placed on the desk 3 weeks ago, sliding it across the mahogany as though it were a dinner invitation rather than a death sentence. £47,000, Your Grace. By spring. His father had been a proud man. Proud men, Callum had learned, kept excellent secrets. The crumbling East Wing wasn't age, it was debt. The sold paintings weren't relocated to the London house, they were gone. The dismissed staff weren't given generous retirement, they were an economy. And now the solution sat inside at the pianoforte, playing something forgettable. Lady Isabella Vane. 24 years old. Daughter of the wealthiest textile merchant ever to buy himself a baronetcy. Beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful, flawless, cold, and very aware of its own value. Her dowry would clear every penny. His mother had made that arithmetic very clear. This is not a choice, Callum. This is arithmetic. He pushed open the stable door. The smell hit him first, hay, horse, the particular warmth of large animals in a cold night. Something unknotted in his chest. It always did. He wasn't sure when the stables had become the only place in Ashford Hall where he could breathe. Perhaps when the drawing rooms had started to feel like negotiating tables. Perhaps when every conversation began to carry a price. He walked to the third stall. Monarch, his father's horse, now technically an asset on a balance sheet somewhere, lifted his great head and blew a warm breath against Callum's palm. "Don't look at me like that," Callum murmured. Monarch looked at him exactly like that. He leaned against the stall door, loosening his cravat with one hand, and closed his eyes for just a moment. He did not hear the movement in the shadows at the far end of the stable. But the shadows heard everything. She had learned, in 11 months at Ashford Hall, that the Duke came to the stables on the nights when the house became too loud. Not loud with noise. Loud with expectation. Ilara didn't move. She rarely did when he came. She simply set down her pen, carefully, so it wouldn't scratch, and waited in the narrow space behind the last stall, where the tackroom door stood half open and the single candle she allowed herself threw just enough light to read by. She had been reading the same column of numbers for the past hour. £47,412. She knew the figure better than the Duke did. She had broken it into quarterly payments, mapped it against the estate's harvest yields, cross-referenced it against 3 outstanding tenant leases that hadn't been collected in 2 years, as though money owed to a Duke simply evaporated out of politeness. It didn't evaporate. It accumulated. She turned the page quietly. Tonight he seemed worse than usual. She could tell by the way he'd spoken to the horse, that low, unguarded murmur that men only used when they were certain no one was listening. She was always listening. Not out of curiosity. Out of necessity. Information, she had learned, was the only currency available to a woman with no name, no money, and no options. She had plenty of information. What she did not have was a way out. Callum straightened after a while, rolling his shoulder where the tension had settled like a stone. He ran a hand along Monarch's neck, and that was when he noticed it. The horse's left foreleg. The way he shifted his weight. Just slightly, the kind of thing you'd miss if you weren't looking. He frowned, crouching down, running his fingers along the tendon. Bowed tendon, he said quietly, to no one. I'll have Garrett look at it in the morning. Poultice and rest. It's not the tendon. Callum stood up very fast. The voice had come from the shadows. Calm. Certain. Slightly irritated, as though correcting a mistake that should have been obvious. A young woman stepped into the edge of the light. Dark hair loose around her shoulders, she'd clearly not expected company. A worn wool shawl. Ink on her fingers. She didn't curtsy. She didn't flinch. She looked at Monarch's leg, then back at Callum. The hoof. Left front. There's a bruise under the shoe, you can feel it if you press here. She pointed, not touching the horse, simply indicating. A poultice won't do anything. He needs the shoe pulled and 2 days off the ground. Callum stared at her. She met his stare without any particular difficulty. You're certain, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I've been watching him favor it for 4 days, she said. I was waiting for Garrett to notice. Garrett has been here 15 years. Yes, she said simply. I know. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, exactly. It was the silence of two people recalibrating. Callum looked at the horse. Then back at her. You're the new stable hand. Ilara. Yes, Your Grace. How long have you been standing back there? A pause. Just brief enough to be honest. Long enough, she said. He should have sent her away. The hour was indecent, the situation entirely improper. A duke alone in a stable after midnight with an unchaperoned young woman was exactly the kind of thing that fueled 3 months of dinner party conversation. He didn't send her away. He pulled the shoe from Monarch's hoof himself, or tried to, until Ilara wordlessly picked up the correct tool from the wall and held it out to him without comment. He took it. You have ink on your hands, he said, while he worked. I was writing. At this hour? The numbers don't change depending on the time of day, Your Grace. He looked up at that. She was watching Monarch, not him, one hand resting lightly on the horse's flank, steadying him. What numbers? He almost asked. He didn't. But the question sat with him all the way back to the house, through the drawing room where Isabella had finally stopped playing, past his mother's carefully arranged smile, up the stairs and into a bedroom that felt, as it always did, slightly too large for one person. The numbers don't change depending on the time of day. He lay in the dark and thought about that for longer than was reasonable. Downstairs, in the stable, Ilara blew out her candle. She folded the page of numbers carefully and tucked it inside the cover of a battered ledger. Then she sat for a moment in the dark, listening to the horses breathe. He hadn't asked about the numbers. But he'd noticed them. She pressed her ink-stained fingers together and stared at the ceiling. He noticed, she thought. And she wasn't sure yet whether that was very good or very, very bad. Ilara Voss had not always slept in a stable. There had been a time, not so long ago that she'd forgotten the feel of it, but long enough that it sometimes seemed like someone else's life, when she had slept in a room with 3 windows. When there had been a fire laid every evening before she came upstairs. When the ledgers she worked on had her family's name on the cover, not someone else's. That time ended on a Tuesday. She remembered the day with an archivist's precision, the 14th of October, 1887. Rain. Her father's solicitor arriving without an appointment, hat in hand, face the color of old wax. The sound of her mother setting down a teacup very carefully, as though if she was gentle enough with the china, the news might also be gentle. It was not gentle. The Voss family, it turned out, had been robbed very politely. Her father, Edmund Voss, had been a man of modest title and a modest intelligence. A younger son of a younger son, no grand estate, no seat in the Lords, but he had built something real. A shipping consultancy, 3 properties in Derbyshire, and a reputation for financial acumen that had made him, quietly, indispensable to half a dozen noble houses, including the House of Ashford. The late Duke, Callum's father, had approached Edmund Voss 12 years ago with an arrangement. A private loan, structured as a partnership, managed through a series of documents that Edmund had trusted because the Duke of Ashford's word, in those days, was considered sufficient collateral. He had been wrong about that. When the late Duke died, those documents disappeared. What replaced them was a single letter, dated 6 months before the Duke's death, in which Edmund Voss appeared to have signed over the partnership, and with it, the properties, voluntarily. He had signed nothing of the sort. Ilara knew this because she had been in the room when the original documents were drawn up. She had been 17, sitting in the corner with a book she wasn't reading, listening to every word. Her father had let her stay because he'd always said she had a better head for contracts than most men twice her age. She had remembered every clause. And not one of them matched the letter that had stolen their life. The solicitor, her family's, not the Duke's, had advised them to accept the loss. The Duke is dead, Miss Voss. His son has inherited. A legal challenge would take years, cost more than the properties are worth, and the Ashford name carries considerable. The Ashford name, Ilara had said, very quietly, is the reason we are in this room. The solicitor had looked at her father. Her father had looked at his hands. They had accepted the loss. Ilara had not. She had arrived at Ashford Hall 11 months ago under the name Ilara Voss, her real name, which no one had thought to connect to a minor Derbyshire family ruined 18 months prior. She had presented herself to the stable master, Garrett, as a woman who knew horses and needed work. Both of these things were true. What she had not mentioned was the third thing, that she also knew the Duke's finances better than his own steward did, that she had spent 4 months before arriving studying every public record, every tenant lease, every parliamentary filing connected to the Ashford estate, and that tucked inside the lining of her traveling bag was a copy, painstakingly reconstructed from memory, of the original partnership documents. She needed the originals. They were somewhere in this house. In the library, most likely, or the estate office. Filed under something innocuous. Hidden in plain sight, the way powerful men hid inconvenient things. She had been looking for 11 months. The work itself was not unpleasant. She liked horses. She liked the early mornings, the particular quiet of the stable before the house woke up, the straightforward honesty of animals who had no interest in your social standing. And she liked, though she would not have admitted it, not even to herself, the numbers. Because the numbers told a story that no one else in Ashford Hall seemed to be reading. The estate was in serious trouble. Not the vague, aristocratic sort of trouble that meant fewer dinner parties. The specific, structural kind that meant creditors, then lawyers, then the slow dissolution of everything. The late Duke's borrowing had been catastrophic, and the current Duke, young, proud, and apparently determined not to show weakness, had been managing it alone, with a steward who filed reports 3 weeks late and a solicitor who charged by the hour for advice that was, in Ilara's professional assessment, largely useless. She had started keeping her own ledger 8 months ago. Not because anyone asked her to. Because the numbers were wrong, and wrong numbers bothered her the way a wrong note bothered a musician. Slowly, carefully, she had begun to see a way out for the estate. It required renegotiating 2 tenant leases, calling in a debt from a Lord Fenwick who seemed to have forgotten he owed the Ashford estate £3,000, and restructuring the primary creditor arrangement over 4 years instead of 2. It was entirely achievable. It would also clear every penny without Lady Isabella Vane's dowry. Elara had not decided yet what to do with this information. The morning after the stable encounter, she rose before dawn as usual. She fed the horses. She checked Monarch's hoof, better already, the bruising less pronounced. She updated her ledger. She did not think about the Duke. She thought about him considerably. Not in the way that would have alarmed her. She was not a foolish woman, and she had no interest in becoming one. She thought about him the way she thought about a chess problem. Something had shifted on the board last night and she needed to understand what. He had noticed the numbers. He hadn't asked about them. Why? Either he was incurious, which she doubted, given the look on his face. Or he was cautious. Cautious men, in her experience, were either very dangerous or very careful. Sometimes both. She was still turning this over when Garrett appeared in the stable doorway, slightly out of breath. "His Grace is asking for you," Garrett said. He looked uncomfortable in the way people looked when they were delivering a message they didn't understand. Elara set down the brush. "For me," she repeated. "Specifically." She took a breath. Smoothed her apron. Tucked one ink-stained hand behind her back out of habit. "Right," she said. "Where?" He was in the estate office. Standing at the window, still in his riding clothes, a single sheet of paper in his hand. He didn't turn when she entered. "Close the door," he said. She did. He turned then. Looked at her for a moment with that same recalibrating expression he'd worn in the stable, as though he kept expecting her to be something simpler than she was. He placed the paper on the desk and turned it to face her. It was a bill. A creditor's notice. The third one that month, she knew, from the same firm. "My steward tells me this cannot be addressed until the spring settlement," Callum said. "He has told me this 3 times. I would like a second opinion." Elara looked at the bill. She knew exactly what it was. She knew exactly how to address it, how much it would cost, and which of the outstanding tenant accounts would cover it without touching the primary reserves. She looked up at him. "Why me?" she asked. "Because," he said, with the careful precision of a man choosing words under pressure, "you were doing sums in a stable at midnight, and you were right about my horse." The room was quiet. Somewhere outside, a cart was making its way down the gravel drive. Elara looked at the bill again. She should say no. She should say, "I'm a stable hand, Your Grace, I don't know anything about creditor notices." She should keep her head down, keep looking for the documents, keep her distance from a man whose father had destroyed her family. She pulled the bill toward her. "You have an outstanding rental collection from a Mr. Theodore Alcott," she said. 18 months arrears. If you send notice this week, you'll have enough to cover this and the second creditor notice, the one dated the 3rd of November that your steward also hasn't actioned." Silence. "How," Callum said slowly, "do you know about the second notice?" She met his eyes. "Your steward files his reports in the estate office," she said. "The window faces the stable yard. It's open most mornings." It wasn't the whole truth. But it wasn't a lie. Callum stared at her for a long moment. Something moved across his face, not suspicion, exactly. More like the expression of a man who has been playing cards with a losing hand for a very long time and has just realized someone else at the table can see the whole deck. "And the third notice," he said quietly. "The one that arrives next week?" Elara blinked. He knew about the third notice. She hadn't known he knew. They looked at each other across the desk, across the creditor's bill, across 11 months of careful distance. "Lord Fenwick," she said. "He owes this estate £3,000. Has for 2 years. Fenwick is a friend of my father's." "Your father," Elara said, and kept her voice very steady, "is dead." The bluntness of it landed in the room like something dropped on stone. She watched him absorb it, the slight tightening around his jaw, the stillness. Then, unexpectedly, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. But close. "I'll have the Alcott notice sent today," he said. "And Fenwick?" "I'll write to Fenwick." He paused. "Is there anything else?" She should have said no. She should have taken that as her exit. "Your harvest yield from the North Field has been underreported for 3 seasons, she said. "Whoever is filing those numbers is either incompetent or dishonest. I haven't decided which yet." This time he did smile. Brief, controlled, but real. "Neither have I," he said. She left the estate office the same way she'd entered, quietly, without fuss. But walking back across the stable yard, she was aware of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope, exactly. She was too careful for hope. Something more like the sensation of a door that had been locked for a very long time, making, very faintly, the sound of a key. She pressed her ink-stained fingers together and kept walking. She still needed those documents. And now, she suspected, the Duke of Ashford was going to make everything considerably more complicated. Lady Isabella Vane arrived at 10:30, which was, Callum's mother had informed him at breakfast, fashionably punctual. Callum had nodded and said nothing. He had learned, in 29 years, that most of what happened at Ashford Hall required him to nod and say nothing. She came in a carriage that was newer than anything in the Ashford stable, lacquered black, brass fittings, a coachman in livery that had clearly never seen a Yorkshire winter. The footman opened the door before the wheels had fully stopped, and Lady Isabella descended with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had never once in her life wondered whether she was welcome. She was, objectively, beautiful. Dark hair dressed in the current fashion, not a pin out of place despite an hour's journey. A traveling coat the color of deep burgundy, trimmed in velvet. Gloves so white they seemed to generate their own light. Callum's mother met her at the door with both hands extended. "My dear Isabella. You look absolutely radiant." "Lady Ashford." Isabella pressed her cheek to his mother's with a warmth that was entirely practiced and entirely convincing. "And your Grace." She turned to Callum. Her eyes were very blue, very clear, and very evaluating. He took her hand and bowed over it correctly. "Lady Isabella. Welcome to Ashford Hall." "It's lovely," she said, glancing up at the facade with the same expression one might use appraising a horse at market. Rather grand. Rather mortgaged, Callum thought. He smiled. "Please," he said. "Come in out of the cold." The breakfast room had been arranged with considerable effort. Callum could tell because the silver had been polished, it was only polished for guests his mother considered important, and because Mrs. Hartwell, the housekeeper, had appeared in the doorway twice already to adjust a flower arrangement that did not need adjusting. They sat, his mother at the head, Isabella to her right, Callum across from Isabella. The correct distance. The correct formation. A chaperone, Isabella's companion, a pale and largely silent woman named Miss Price, took her place at the far end of the table with the practiced invisibility of a woman who had spent years perfecting it. The tea was poured. The toast was offered. And the careful, intricate performance of a society breakfast began. "Your journey was comfortable?" his mother asked. "Perfectly. Papa insisted on the new carriage. He worries terribly about the roads this time of year." "How thoughtful. And Sir William as well?" "Wonderfully. He sends his regards and hopes to speak with you and the Duke about the arrangements at your convenience." "The arrangements." The word sat on the table between them like a centerpiece, decorative, unavoidable, impossible to ignore. Callum reached for his coffee. Isabella was not unintelligent. That, he had to grant her. Over the course of the next hour, she managed his mother with the deft precision of a diplomat, agreeing where agreement was expected, offering mild, charming opinions where opinions were invited, deflecting where deflection was required. She asked about the estate's history with what appeared to be genuine interest. She admired the portrait of Callum's grandmother with what appeared to be genuine taste. She was, in every measurable sense, exactly what the situation required. He watched her the way he had learned to watch people, not at the moments they intended to be seen, but at the small moments in between. The footman, young, perhaps 17, new to the position, mishandled the toast rack. It slid, clattered, sent a silver knife skidding toward the edge of the table. The boy caught it, flushing scarlet. "I beg your pardon, my lady," he said, barely above a whisper. Isabella looked at him. It lasted only a moment, that look. Then her expression smoothed back to pleasant, and she said, "No harm done," in a tone that was perfectly civil. But the look had lasted a moment. Callum set down his coffee cup. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say. It was such a small thing, a flicker, a fraction of a second, the kind of thing that could be explained away a dozen different ways. He noted it anyway. He always noted things like that. "Callum tells me you have a wonderful eye for estate management," his mother said to Isabella, in the bright, leading tone that meant she had rehearsed this transition. Isabella smiled. "I wouldn't claim expertise. But Papa always said that running a household well is simply running the numbers well. I've tried to learn." "Precisely so," his mother said warmly. "Ashford Hall would benefit enormously from a woman with that kind of mind." Callum looked at his plate. A woman with that kind of mind. He thought, without intending to, about a creditor's bill on a desk. About ink-stained fingers. About "your father is dead" delivered with the calm precision of a surgeon. He thought about harvest yields underreported for 3 seasons. He reached for the toast. "Do you ride, Lady Isabella?" he asked. "A little," she said. "Side saddle, of course. I find it more elegant." "Of course," he said. After breakfast, his mother proposed a tour of the West Gallery. Portraits, she said, were so important for understanding a family's character. Isabella agreed that they were absolutely essential. Miss Price rose silently and fell into step 3 paces behind. Callum followed, his hands clasped behind his back, half listening to his mother's commentary on a painting of his great-uncle that she had always considered underlit. From the window at the end of the gallery, he could see the stable yard. He didn't mean to look. He looked anyway. The yard was quiet at this hour. One of the stable lads was leading a gray horse in a slow circle, exercise, routine. Nothing remarkable. Then a figure emerged from the stable door, paused, looked up at something in the eaves. Dark hair. An apron. A worn wool shawl that was entirely inadequate for November. She stood there for a moment, apparently addressing a problem with the door latch, then disappeared back inside. Callum. He turned. His mother was watching him with the particular expression she reserved for moments when he was not paying sufficient attention to something she considered important. Isabella was watching him too. Her expression was less readable. "The portrait," his mother said pleasantly, "of your grandfather." "Yes," he said. "Of course. Forgive me." He turned his back to the window. Lunch was served at 1. By 2 o'clock, the arrangements had been discussed, obliquely, carefully, in the language of polite society where nothing important was ever said directly. The wedding, it was suggested, might take place in the spring. Or perhaps earlier, his mother said lightly. February can be quite beautiful here. Isabella inclined her head. Whatever suits the Duke. They both looked at Callum. February. 12 weeks. He thought about £47,000. He thought about his mother's face. He thought about the East Wing, about the sold paintings, about a father who had kept excellent secrets. February, he said, is certainly a possibility. His mother's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. Relief, carefully contained. Isabella smiled. It reached her eyes, but her eyes, Callum noticed, were already moving on. Calculating. Settling something internally. He recognized that expression. He'd seen a version of it, just this morning, across a desk. The difference was that this morning, the calculation had been entirely transparent. Honest in its way. The numbers laid out plainly, no performance required. This was something else. He picked up his wine glass and said nothing. Isabella left at 4 o'clock, as the light was going gray. At the door, she pressed Callum's hand briefly, correctly, the right duration, the right pressure, and said, "I look forward to knowing Ashford Hall better." "As do I," he said. He watched the lacquered carriage roll down the drive until it rounded the tree line and disappeared. His mother appeared at his elbow. "Well," she said, with the satisfaction of a woman who has moved a chess piece into exactly the right square. "She is everything we could hope for." Callum watched the empty drive. "She is very accomplished," he said. His mother patted his arm. "It will come, Callum. These things take time." She went back inside. He stood at the door a moment longer, in the cold. Then he turned and walked, without particularly deciding to, in the direction of the stable yard. The stable was warm after the outside air. Monarch lifted his head from his hay as Callum entered. He walked to the third stall out of habit. Checked the hoof. Better, considerably better. He's favoring it less. He didn't startle this time. Ilara was at the far end, filling a water bucket. She didn't look up. "He'll be sound by Thursday if he stays off hard ground," she said. "Good." He rested his arms on the stall door. "The Alcott notice went this morning." A pause. She set down the bucket. "And Fenwick?" "Letter drafted. Goes tomorrow." She nodded, a small, precise nod, like a ledger entry confirmed. He watched her pick up the bucket again and move to the next stall. She worked with an economy of motion that suggested someone who had learned not to waste anything, not energy, not words, not time. "You were right," he said, "about the harvest yields. I looked at the records this afternoon." She stopped. "And," she said, carefully, 18 months of underreporting. Consistent enough to be deliberate." She said nothing. But she set the bucket down again, slowly. "You already knew," he said. "I suspected," she said. "I didn't have access to the original yield records to confirm. I'll have them pulled." She looked at him then, directly, the way she'd looked at him last night. Not deferential. Not bold. simply level. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. It was a fair question. He had been asking himself the same thing for most of the afternoon. "Because," he said, "my steward has been here 15 years, and in 15 years no one has mentioned Fenwick, the Olcott arrears, or the harvest yields." He paused. "You've been here 11 months. The number landed between them. She knew that he knew she'd been counting. He knew that she knew he'd been counting too. "Your Grace," she said, after a moment. "I am a stable hand." "Yes," he said. "You are." He pushed off the stall door and walked back toward the entrance. At the door, he stopped. "There's a ledger," he said, without turning. "In the estate office. Bottom drawer, left side. It hasn't been opened since my father died. A beat. If you were to look at it, I wouldn't need to know about it." The stable was very quiet. He walked out into the cold. Elara stood very still for a long time after the sound of his footsteps faded. Then she sat down on the nearest hay bale, pressed her ink-stained fingers against her knees, and stared at the middle distance. He had just told her where to look. Not directly. Not in any way that could be repeated or proven. But clearly enough that there was no mistaking it. Which meant one of two things. Either the Duke of Ashford was the most dangerously trusting man she had ever encountered. Or he already knew far more about her than she had believed. She pressed her hands together. Felt the familiar roughness of the calluses, the dry skin, the ink that never quite washed out. "Think," she told herself. "Think before you move." But underneath the thinking, something else was happening, something smaller and more treacherous. The memory of a voice saying "you were right about my horse" with a directness that contained no condescension, no surprise, just acknowledgement. She pressed it down firmly. She had a job to do. She picked up the bucket and went back to work. The first night, they didn't speak at all. Callum came at 11:30, as he always did. Elara was at her usual place behind the tack-room door, ledger open, candle burning low. He walked to Monarch's stall, checked the hoof without being asked, stood for a while in the particular silence of a man who has run out of places to put his thoughts. Then he left. Elara turned a page and kept working. The second night, he brought a lamp. She noticed it immediately, a small thing, but significant. A lamp meant he intended to stay longer than a man who only came to breathe. He hung it on the hook near Monarch's stall and sat down on the bench along the wall, elbows on his knees, and looked at nothing in particular. Elara kept her candle and her corner. After perhaps 20 minutes, he said, without preamble. "Pemberton." She looked up. "The creditor," he said. "The third notice. You mentioned it before I confirmed it. I've been trying to work out how you knew." She was quiet for a moment, weighing. "Pemberton's clerk drinks at the village pub on Friday evenings," she said. "He talks when he drinks. The stable lads listen when people talk." Callum looked at her across the warm dark. "You've been building a picture," he said. "I've been paying attention," she said. "It's not the same thing." He was quiet. "Then, isn't it?" She had no answer for that. Or rather, she had several, and none of them were safe. She looked back down at her ledger. The third night, he asked about the numbers. Not directly, he approached it the way a careful man approached anything he genuinely wanted to know, which was sideways, leaving himself room to retreat if necessary. If someone were to restructure a debt of significant size, he said, conversationally, as though they had been mid-discussion and he was simply continuing, across 4 years rather than 2, what would the creditor require in return for the extension? Elara set down her pen. "Collateral," she said. or a demonstrated revenue increase. Creditors don't extend terms out of goodwill. They extend them when they calculate that patience will yield more than pressure. And if the revenue increase could be demonstrated, then you'd need documentation. Current yield records, corrected. Tenant payment histories, complete. An independent assessment of the estate's productive capacity. She paused. All of which exist. They simply haven't been compiled correctly. The lamp threw a long shadow across the floor between them. You've thought about this, he said. I think about numbers, she said. It's a habit. Most stable hands don't share that habit. No, she agreed. They don't. Another silence. She could feel him deciding something, could feel the weight of it the way you felt weather changing, a shift in pressure before the rain. The ledger, he said. In the estate office. Did you look at it? She had, of course. 2 nights ago, in the early hours, when the house was entirely dark and Mrs. Hartwell's keys were exactly where Alara had noted she kept them. She had found 3 things. The first, confirmation that the harvest underreporting was deliberate, the steward's hand, unmistakable. The second, a debt she hadn't known about, smaller but accruing interest at a punishing rate. The third, nothing. The ledger she most needed, the one that would have contained records from the late Duke's private arrangements, was gone. Removed. The spine still showed where pages had been cut. Someone had been there before her. The ledger, she said carefully, had some pages missing. Callum's expression didn't change. But something behind his eyes did. Yes, he said quietly. I know. She stared at him. You knew, she said. I found it 3 months after my father died, he said. I didn't know what had been in it. I still don't. He looked at the lamp flame. But someone did. Someone who had access to this house. The implication settled over the stable like cold air under a door. Alara pressed her fingers flat against the ledger in her lap. Who, she thought. Who knew those records existed and had reason to remove them? The answer she arrived at was not comfortable. Your Grace, she said, keeping her voice entirely level. How long has your steward been managing the estate accounts? 15 years, Callum said. And then, more quietly, yes. I know. The 4th night, neither of them brought it up. By unspoken agreement, they let it rest, the missing pages, the steward, the thing neither of them was ready to say aloud. There were moves that, once made, couldn't be unmade. Both of them understood that. Instead, Callum arrived to find Alara attempting, with limited success, to coax a young mare who had developed a profound mistrust of her own feed bucket. She knocked it over last week, Alara said, not looking up from her careful, patient crouch near the stall door. Now she's convinced it's going to happen again. Reasonable position, Callum said. It's a bucket. She doesn't know that. Alara glanced up at him. The lamplight caught the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but the architecture of one. Would you, she said, like to try? He raised an eyebrow. I beg your pardon. She doesn't know me well enough yet. New voice might help. She stood, stepping back. Slowly. Don't loom. I don't loom. Your Grace, she said, with great patience, you are 6 feet and some inches of Duke. You loom by default. He looked at her for a moment, the unguarded, slightly startled look of a man who was not often spoken to this way, and was finding, against his better judgment, that he didn't mind it. He crouched down. Held out his hand, flat, toward the mare. Easy, he said quietly. It's just a bucket. Nothing's going to fall. The mare regarded him with enormous, skeptical eyes. "Talk to her more," Ilara said, from behind him. "She needs to hear that you mean it." "I'm talking to a horse about a bucket." "Yes. Keep going." He made a sound that was almost a laugh, short, surprised, quickly controlled. Then he turned back to the mare and continued in a low, unhurried voice, the kind of voice he hadn't used since he was very young and the stables had been the only place no one expected anything of him. After a few minutes, the mare stepped forward and put her nose against his hand. Ilara exhaled quietly. Callum stood up slowly, not to startle her, and turned. Ilara was closer than he'd realized. She'd stepped in to watch, without thinking, and now there were perhaps 2 feet between them in the narrow space of the stall entrance. Neither of them moved. In the warm dark, with the lamp throwing its small circle of gold, he was suddenly acutely aware of very specific things, the ink stain on the inside of her right wrist. The way she was looking up at him, not with deference, not with performance, just with that level, honest attention that she turned on everything, numbers and horses and, apparently, him. He reached past her, slowly, to close the stall latch. His hand brushed hers on the iron. He didn't pull back. Neither did she. 1 second. Perhaps 2. Then Ilara stepped aside, smoothly, creating distance the way a careful woman created distance, not with drama, but with precision. "She'll be fine by morning," she said, and her voice was entirely steady. "Good," he said. His voice was also entirely steady. They were both, he suspected, working rather hard at that. He picked up his lamp. Walked to the stable door. Stopped. He wanted to say something. Something that acknowledged the 4 knights and the numbers and the missing ledger pages and the hand on the iron latch and all of it. He said, "Good night, Miss Voss." It was the first time he had used her name. Behind him, a pause so brief it might have been imagined. "Good night, Your Grace." She stood in the dark after he left and pressed her hand, the hand that had been on the latch, flat against the rough wood of the stall. Stop it, she told herself. She was here for the documents. She was here for her family. She was here because a dead duke had stolen everything her father had built, and someone in this house had covered it up, and she was the only person left who knew the original truth of it. She was not here to notice that Callum Ashford, when he thought no one was looking, spoke to frightened horses as though their fear was entirely reasonable and worth his time. She picked up her ledger. She did not sleep well. The 5th night, he didn't come. She told herself she wasn't listening for footsteps. She told herself the cold that settled into the stable around midnight was just the weather. She worked until her candle burned to nothing, then sat in the dark for a while, which was entirely practical and not at all the behavior of a woman waiting for something she had no business waiting for. He didn't come. In the morning, she learned from the stable lads that the Duke had ridden to Leeds the previous afternoon for an unscheduled meeting with his solicitor. She absorbed this information and went back to work. She reminded herself, a woman with a plan. Plans did not require dukes to arrive at 11:30 with lamps. Plans required patience, precision, and the consistent application of intelligence to problems. She was very good at plans. She opened her ledger to a fresh page. At the top, in her neat, careful hand, she wrote, "Outstanding questions." Then she sat for a moment, pen hovering. Then she wrote, against every instruction she had given herself. Who removed the pages? And does he suspect what was in them? She stared at it. Then, below it, smaller, as though she could diminish it by writing it small. Why did he tell me where to look? She closed the ledger. Outside, the stable yard was beginning to lighten, grey and cold and entirely indifferent to the fact that Ilara Voss had spent the last 4 nights slowly, carefully, and completely against her will, beginning to trust a man whose family had ruined hers. She picked up a brush and went to see about Monarch's hoof. It was Callum's mother who noticed first. Not because she was looking for anything specific. Eleanor Ashford had not survived 30 years of managing a ducal household by looking for specific things. She had survived by noticing everything and filing it away with the patience of a woman who understood that information, properly stored, was more useful than information immediately deployed. She noticed the lamp. It was a small thing. The brass lamp from Callum's study, the one he preferred for reading, the one that had sat on the same corner of the same desk for 11 years, was not in his study on Tuesday morning. Mrs. Hartwell mentioned it in passing, only because she had been looking for it to polish the fitting. It turned up in the stable, hanging on a hook near the third stall. Eleanor said nothing. She began, instead, to pay attention to the evenings. It took her 4 days. On the 5th day, she went to Isabella. They were sitting in the blue parlor, ostensibly reviewing the preliminary guest list for the engagement announcement. Isabella had come for the afternoon, as she had taken to doing 3 times a week, a frequency that Callum's mother had encouraged and that Callum had not discouraged, which was, Eleanor knew, not the same thing. She set down the guest list. "I wonder," she said, in the tone she used for things that were not wondering at all, "if you have noticed anything particular about the stable yard." Isabella looked up. Her blue eyes were very clear. "The stable yard," she repeated. "The staff there. One member in particular. A young woman." A pause. Isabella set down her own list with the deliberate care of a woman who had just been handed something she intended to pick up very carefully. "Tell me," she said. They came at 11:30. Ilara heard them before she saw them, the crunch of gravel that was too purposeful for a single person, the flicker of 2 lanterns bobbing across the stable yard. She was on her feet before the door opened, ledger already closed, candle already pinched. It didn't matter. The door swung wide, and the light from 2 lanterns flooded the stable. Eleanor Ashford stood in the entrance, perfectly composed, wrapped in a dark wool coat, her gray hair pinned as precisely as if it were noon. Behind her, Isabella, and this was the detail that Ilara registered with cold clarity, was not in traveling clothes. She had come prepared to stay. Callum was 3 steps behind them both. He had clearly not known this was happening. Ilara could tell because he stopped in the doorway when he saw her, and something moved across his face that he didn't have time to arrange. Then it was gone, and he was composed again. Eleanor's gaze swept the stable, landed on Ilara, and stayed there with the settled weight of a woman arriving at a conclusion she had already formed. "Your Grace," Ilara said. She curtsied, correctly, the right depth for a servant addressing a duchess. "This," Eleanor said to Callum, without taking her eyes off Ilara, "is what you've been coming here for." It was not a question. The stable was very quiet. One of the horses shifted in its stall. The lamp flames bent sideways in the draught from the open door. Callum said, with a steadiness that Ilara suspected cost him considerably, "This is a member of the stable staff. There is nothing here that requires." "She has ink on her hands," Isabella said. Everyone looked at Ilara's hands. She did not move them. "She reads," Isabella continued, with the precise, unhurried tone of a woman laying out evidence she had prepared in advance. "She keeps a ledger. She has been here 11 months, which is 2 months longer than any other temporary stable hand in the estate's recent history." She paused. "And 3 of the estate's creditor matters have been actioned in the past 2 weeks, after months of inaction, with a precision that your steward has not previously demonstrated." The silence was considerable. Ilara kept her face entirely neutral. Inside, she was rapidly recalculating how much Isabella knew, how long she had known it, how she had found out. The creditor actions. That had been the thread. She had pulled it and arrived here. She was, Elara thought with cold clarity, more intelligent than she had given her credit for. "Your Grace," Eleanor said to Callum, and now the composure had an edge to it, the particular edge of a woman who loved her son and was furious with him simultaneously. "I would like an explanation." Callum looked at his mother. Then at Isabella. Then, for just a fraction of a second, at Elara. She saw him make the decision. "Her name is Elara Voss," he said. "She is a distant relation, on my father's side. Quite distant." He said it with the calm authority of a man accustomed to being believed, which was, she supposed, the primary advantage of a dukedom. "She came to Ashford Hall in difficult circumstances, and I arranged for her to stay quietly while we determined a more permanent situation." "In the stable," Isabella said. "Temporarily. The arrangement has been reconsidered." He looked at his mother. "I had intended to speak to you about it. The library collection needs organizing. Mrs. Hartwell has been saying so for 2 years. Elara has the education for it. I thought she might serve as a temporary consultant." The word consultant fell into the room with a slightly uncertain thud, like something placed on a surface that might not hold it. Eleanor stared at her son for a long moment. Isabella looked at Elara. Her expression was not hostile, it was more precise than that. Measuring. Elara held her gaze and said nothing. "A relation," Eleanor said finally. "A distant one. On your father's side." "Quite distant," Callum confirmed. Another silence. Eleanor turned to look at Elara properly, the frank, comprehensive look of a woman who was deciding something and wanted to make sure she had all the relevant information first. Elara stood straight. Did not fidget. Met the look without challenge, without submission, without anything except the quiet steadiness of a woman who had been in worse rooms than this. "What is your full name?" Eleanor asked. "Elara Voss, Your Grace." "And your father?" "Edmund Voss. He passed 2 years ago." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Eleanor's expression. A name recognized, perhaps. A file opened in that careful, stored-away mind. "Derbyshire," Eleanor said. "Yes, Your Grace." The lamp flames bent again in the draught. Somewhere outside, an owl. Eleanor looked at her son one more time, a look that contained several complete sentences, none of them comfortable, and then she straightened slightly and said, in a voice from which she had removed all inflection. "The blue guest room on the 2nd floor is available. Mrs. Hartwell will see to the arrangements in the morning." She turned toward the door. "We will discuss this further at breakfast." She walked out. Isabella did not follow immediately. She stood for a moment, looking at Elara, with an expression that was almost, not quite, but almost, admiring. "Miss Voss," she said pleasantly. "Lady Isabella," Elara replied. A beat. Then Isabella smiled, small, careful, the smile of a woman who had noted your position on the board and was already planning her next move. She followed Eleanor out into the dark. Callum stayed. He stood in the stable doorway, his lamp in his hand, looking at Elara. The horses had settled again. The draught from the open door was cold. She looked back at him. There were, she thought, approximately 14 things she wanted to say. She sorted through them and found that not one of them was appropriate, useful, or wise. She settled for, distant relation. "It was the first thing I thought of," he said. "It's not very convincing." "No," he admitted. "It isn't." He looked at the floor briefly, then back up. "I apologize. I should have," he stopped. "Tried again." There wasn't time to ask you. No, she said. There wasn't. You don't have to accept it. The arrangement. If you'd rather. Your Grace. He stopped. She looked at him steadily. I'll take the blue room, she said. Something in him, she could see it, just barely, released. Right, he said. Good. He set his lamp down on the bench and began, without apparent reason, to check the bolt on the stall nearest the door. She watched him do this. It was an entirely unnecessary task. He did it anyway, with great attention. She'll find out, Elara said quietly. Isabella. The relation story won't hold. I know. She's already looking. I know that too. Then we have time, he said. Not much. But some. He looked up from the bolt. Is that enough? She understood what he was asking. Not about the room, or the lie, or Isabella's investigation. He was asking whether there was time to find what she needed before everything came apart. She thought about the missing ledger pages. About the steward. About the copy she'd reconstructed from memory, folded inside her traveling bag, waiting. It depends, she said, on whether you're willing to look in places that might be uncomfortable. Such as? Your father's private correspondence. Whatever your steward has been filing under the wrong headings. And, she paused. The estate's original deed arrangements from 1875 to 1887. The lamp light. His face, very still. Why 1875 to 1887, he said. She held his gaze. Because that's when the arrangements were made, she said. The ones that should still be on record. The ones that aren't. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up. She could hear it moving through the trees at the edge of the stable yard. My father, he said slowly, made a great many arrangements. Yes, she said. Not all of them were. He stopped. I suspected. I didn't know the specifics. I do, she said. Some of them. He looked at her with the expression she had come to recognize, the recalibration, the sense of a man adjusting the picture he'd been working from. How, he said. She pressed her ink-stained fingers together. Because, she said, one of those arrangements was with my father. The stable was very quiet. Callum Ashford stood in the lamplight and looked at Elara Voss and understood, she could see it happening, the full shape of what he had invited into his house. Not a distant relation. Not a stable hand. Not a coincidence. He didn't look away. Breakfast, he said finally, is going to be interesting. Elara let out a breath she hadn't quite realized she'd been holding. Yes, she said. It is. She picked up her ledger. He picked up his lamp. They walked out of the stable into the cold dark, 6 feet apart, not speaking, the crunch of gravel marking the distance between what had just ended and whatever was about to begin. She lay awake in the blue room for a long time. The ceiling was unfamiliar. The mattress was softer than she'd slept on in over a year. The fire, Mrs. Hartwell had, true to Eleanor's word, seen to it, threw warm light across walls papered in pale blue and ivory. She stared at it and thought about her father's face the morning the solicitor came. She thought about what Callum had said. Not all of them were. He hadn't finished the sentence. But she had heard what he hadn't said, and it sat with her now like a stone in still water, heavier, somehow, for its stillness. He had known his father was not an honorable man. He had been carrying that, quietly, alone, alongside £47,000 and a crumbling East Wing and a marriage he didn't want. She closed her eyes. Don't, she told herself. But the thought was already there, small and inconvenient and impossible to file away. He was not his father. The blue room had a writing desk. This was the first thing Alara noticed in the morning, when the fire had burned low and the gray November light was coming through the curtains. A proper desk, not the upturned crate she'd used in the stable, not the corner of the estate office floor she'd sometimes worked on when the house was dark. A desk with a lamp and an inkwell and a chair with a cushion on it. She sat down at it before she did anything else. Opened her ledger. Reviewed the outstanding figures. Added 3 new lines she'd been working through in her head during the night. Then she closed it, straightened her back, and looked at the room. Right, she thought. Think about where you are. She was in the house now. The house where the documents were. Breakfast was, as promised, interesting. Eleanor Ashford sat at the head of the table with the composed authority of a woman who had decided, overnight, on a position and intended to hold it. Her position, as far as Alara could interpret, was, "This has happened, I do not entirely approve, but I will manage it as I manage everything, which is to say efficiently and without visible distress." Isabella was not present. She had returned to her father's house the previous evening and would not arrive until Thursday. This, Alara understood, was a gift. 2 days. Perhaps 3. Miss Voss, Eleanor said, passing the toast with the brisk courtesy she apparently extended to everyone regardless of feeling. "Callum tells me you have some familiarity with library organization." "Yes, Your Grace. The Ashford collection is extensive. Quite disorganized, I'm afraid. My late husband was thorough in his acquisition and somewhat less thorough in his filing." "I understand. You'll start this morning, I think." Eleanor poured her tea. "Mrs. Hartwell will show you the room." Callum, across the table, was looking at his plate with the careful attention of a man who was not looking at Alara. "Thank you, Your Grace," Alara said. "I'll be thorough." Eleanor glanced at her over the rim of her cup. Something moved in her expression, not warmth, exactly, but a species of acknowledgement. "See that you are," she said. The library was on the first floor, east wing. Mrs. Hartwell opened the door, said, "There we are then," in the tone of a woman delivering a problem she was glad to transfer to someone else, and left. Alara stood in the doorway. It was a large room. Floor-to-ceiling shelves on 3 walls, a pair of tall windows facing the stable yard. She noted this immediately, reflexively, and in the center, a reading table large enough for 8 people, currently occupied by a landscape of boxes, unsorted papers, rolled maps, and at least 4 incomplete card catalogs that appeared to have been started and abandoned at different points across several decades. It smelled of dust and old paper and, faintly, of pipe tobacco. She walked in slowly. Ran one finger along the nearest shelf. Read 3 spines. Opened a box. Closed it. Then she went to the window. From here, she could see the stable yard clearly. The 3rd stall window. The path Callum walked each evening. She turned away from the window. Against the far wall, floor to ceiling, behind a library ladder that needed a new wheel, correspondence files. Labeled by year. In the late Duke's handwriting. She found 1879 immediately. She found 1882 2 shelves up. 1885 was where it should be. 1886 was missing. 1887 was missing. She stood very still for a moment, her hand resting on the gap where 1887 should have been. Then she climbed down the ladder, went back to the reading table, sat down, and began, with great patience, to work out where else they might be. She did not find them that day. Or the next. But she found other things. A letter from a Lord Alderton, dated 1883, referencing the arrangement with Voss in a way that was oblique but unmistakable. A payment record that didn't correspond to any estate transaction she could find. A deed reference number that, when she traced it through the publicly available parliamentary land records she had memorized before arriving, matched one of her family's Derbyshire properties. She kept notes. Small, precise. Tucked inside the ledger. The picture was assembling itself. On Thursday, Isabella returned. She arrived at noon, went directly to Eleanor, and spent an hour in the blue parlor with the door closed. Ilara, passing in the corridor with an armful of correspondence files, did not slow her step. At 3 o'clock, there was a tea. A small gathering, Eleanor called it. For women, Eleanor herself, Isabella, a Lady Mortimer who was apparently an old friend, and Ilara, introduced as Callum's relation, assisting with the library. Lady Mortimer had kind eyes and asked no difficult questions. Isabella asked several. "You're from Derbyshire, Miss Voss?" "Originally, yes." "Lovely county. Do you know the Hale family?" "They have a house near Matlock." "I don't believe I've met them." "Or the Carvers?" "Large estate, north of Bakewell." "I'm afraid not." Ilara smiled. "My family's connections were rather modest." Isabella smiled back. "Of course." She moved on to something else. But Ilara felt the shape of the conversation, the specific probing of someone building a map, marking what was confirmed and what remained unknown. She's looking for the edges of the lie, Ilara thought. She'll find them if I give her enough surface to work with. She gave her as little surface as possible. That evening, a dinner. 12 people. 3 courses. The full performance of a formal Ashford Hall table, which meant correct precedence, correct cutlery, and a conversational etiquette that Ilara had, in another life, been taught and had since spent a year deliberately not practicing. She was seated between Lord Mortimer, kind eyes, like his wife, talked mostly about horses, and a Mr. Havelock, who was something in Parliament and clearly considered himself the most interesting person in any given room. She said very little. She listened. She watched. Callum was at the head of the table. Isabella to his right. His mother to his left. He was doing what she had come to recognize as his dinner performance, attentive, measured, the correct amount of charming. He had clearly done it many hundreds of times. It sat on him like a coat he'd owned for years, well-fitted, slightly stifling. Once, across the length of the table, he glanced at her. Just briefly. Checking, she thought, the way you checked on something you were uncertain about, not with concern exactly, but with attention. She gave the smallest nod. He looked away. Mr. Havelock was saying something about the grain tariff. Ilara returned her attention to him and made a comment that was precise enough to stop him mid-sentence. He blinked. "You follow the parliamentary debates, Miss Voss?" "I find the economic implications interesting," she said. "The 1886 amendment particularly." "Good Lord," said Mr. Havelock, and looked at her with an expression that was trying to decide between impressed and unsettled. Lady Mortimer, across the table, was definitely smiling. Afterward, when the men had gone for their port and the women had arranged themselves in the drawing room with their tea, Isabella sat down beside Ilara. Not near her. Beside her. Deliberately, with the smooth intention of a woman who had chosen her seat. "You're very composed," Isabella said, pleasantly. "I try to be," Ilara said. "It must be quite a change. From, well." A small gesture, entirely graceful. "The previous arrangement." "Everything is a change from everything else," Ilara said. "That's rather the nature of change." Isabella looked at her. A fractional pause. Quite, she said. Then, the library must be fascinating. All those old documents. It's extensive, Elara agreed. The late Duke was a great collector, I understand. So it appears. Of all sorts of things. Isabella turned her teacup slowly in her hands. Documents. Correspondence. Arrangements. The fire crackled. Lady Mortimer was speaking to Eleanor about a mutual acquaintance. 3 other women were discussing a forthcoming concert. Elara looked at Isabella steadily. The collection is quite disorganized, Elara said. I expect it will take some time to understand what's actually there. Isabella met her eyes. I expect it will, she said softly. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and moved away to join Eleanor with a smile that contained, Elara noted, not one single atom of warmth. Callum found her in the library at 10:30. She had lit 3 lamps, the desk lamp, the reading lamp, and the one near the correspondence files, and was cross-referencing the Alderton letter against a land registry entry from 1884, her notes spread in a careful arc across the reading table. He stood in the doorway for a moment before she heard him. You should be in bed, he said. It's late. So should you. He came in. Looked at the table, the letters, the ledger, the neat precise notes in her handwriting, with an expression that was not quite comfortable. How was dinner? He asked. Mr. Havelock knows less about grain tariffs than he believes. The corner of his mouth moved. He generally does. Lady Mortimer is kind. She is. Always has been. Isabella, Elara paused. She asked about the library. Callum was quiet. She's looking for the documents, Elara said. Or looking to confirm they're gone. I'm not sure which yet. Why would she? Because if she knows about the debt, Elara stopped. Chose her words. If she knows what the debt actually is and where it came from, then she also knows that the original arrangements, if they still exist, could reframe everything. The estate's liability. The partnership records. She looked at him. And your father's culpability. Callum sat down in the chair across from her. He looked at the letter she'd been working with. She turned it to face him. He read it. Slowly. She watched his face. He had his father's jaw, she had thought once, in the early weeks, before she'd known him well enough to see the differences. Now she thought, no. He had his father's title and his father's debt and his father's ruined estate. The rest was his own. Lord Alderton, he said. He was a witness, I think. To the original arrangement between your father and mine. He died in 1889. Yes. But witnesses write letters. She touched the edge of the page. And letters get filed. He looked at her. The lamplight was amber and close. Outside, the wind was doing something complicated with the trees. Elara, he said. It was the first time he had used her name without the title before it. Without any title at all. Just the word, direct and careful. She went very still. I need you to know, he said, that whatever those documents say, whatever my father did, I intend to make it right. She looked at him for a long moment. You don't know yet what he did, she said. No. But I know enough. He held her gaze. I know enough. The fire shifted. One of the lamps guttered and steadied. She thought about her father's face. About the solicitor's wax-pale expression. About the 14th of October, and the rain, and a teacup set down very carefully. There's a deed reference, she said, her voice not entirely steady, in the 1883 Alderton letter. If we can find the corresponding estate file. Bottom drawer, he said. Estate office. Right side this time. She stared at him. He looked back, and there was something in his expression that was not quite apology and not quite determination but lived in the space between them. You knew, she said. I found it last week. I was waiting until, he stopped. I needed to understand it myself first. And do you? A long pause. Enough, he said again. Quietly. Enough to know it wasn't right. She didn't go to the estate office that night. She sat in the library after he left, her hands flat on the reading table, and looked at nothing in particular for quite a long time. He knew. He had known, or suspected, or found enough to understand the shape of it, and he had been sitting with it, quietly, alone, in the same way he sat with the debt and the east wing and the coat that didn't quite fit, and he had not looked away from it. She thought about what he had said, I intend to make it right. She had not let herself want that. Not once in 11 months. Wanting things you couldn't have was a luxury she had learned, very specifically, not to afford. But the words were there now, in the amber-lit library, and she couldn't quite put them back. She closed her ledger. She went to bed. She did not sleep for a very long time. She found it on a Wednesday. Not because Wednesday was significant. Not because she had been closer to it on Wednesday than on Tuesday, or because the library had rearranged itself in her favor overnight. She found it on Wednesday because she had been systematically working through every misfiled, misboxed, and deliberately obscured record in the Ashford Library for 11 days, and on Wednesday, at 20 minutes past 10 in the evening, she opened a box labeled Household Correspondence, Miscellaneous 1884 to 1891 and found, tucked between a letter about a broken greenhouse pane and an invoice for dining chairs, a document she had last seen when she was 17 years old. She recognized it before she finished unfolding it. Her father's handwriting. The specific slant of his capital letters, the way he formed his sevens, a habit she had inherited, she knew, because she'd been told so 100 times. You write your sevens like your father, her mother used to say. She pressed the paper flat against the table. It was the original partnership agreement. All 6 pages of it. Her father's signature on every page, annealed in the margins where he had always annealed, top right, small, precise. The late Duke's counter-signature below. The date, March 1881. The terms were exactly as she remembered. A loan of £8,000 from Edmund Voss to the Duke of Ashford, structured as a partnership share in 3 Derbyshire properties. Repayable within 10 years with 4% interest, or redeemable as a full ownership transfer should the Duke default. The Duke had defaulted. Repeatedly, specifically, and on dates she could now match to records she had found in this very library. There was a second document beneath it. She unfolded it slowly. It was the letter. The one that had replaced this agreement. The one in which her father appeared to have voluntarily dissolved the partnership and surrendered the properties. She held both documents under the lamp and looked at them side by side. The signature on the second document was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not the wrong name, not a different hand entirely. Subtly wrong, in the way that only someone who had spent years looking at Edmund Voss's signature would notice. The 7 in Voss. The slight leftward lean of the capital E. A person copying a signature they had studied but not grown up watching. A forgery. A careful one. Good enough to fool a solicitor who had no reason to look closely. Good enough to fool a court, perhaps, if the original had truly been gone. But the original was not gone. It was in her hands. She didn't realize she was crying until a tear hit the paper and she snatched it back, pressing the page flat, checking for damage with hands that were not entirely steady. The paper was fine. She set it down. She pressed her fingers over her mouth and looked at the ceiling and tried, with some precision, to breathe. 11 months. 11 months of hay and cold mornings and numbers that other people didn't read, and a candle burned to nothing, and her father's face on the 14th of October, looking at his hands. He had known. He had known the signature was wrong, she was almost certain. He had known, and he had been advised to let it go, and he had been so tired, so thoroughly and completely tired, that he had let it go. And then he had died. 8 months after the decision. A winter illness, the doctor said. Not dramatic. Not violent. Simply a man who had run out of reasons to fight a Yorkshire winter. She pressed her fingers harder against her mouth. Don't, she thought. Not here. Not now. But the grief was already there, not new grief. She had done her new grieving long ago, the old kind, the settled kind, the kind that lived quietly in your chest and only made itself known when the thing you had been looking for finally appeared and you understood, fully, for the first time, that finding it couldn't fix the part that mattered most. Her father would not see this. She pressed the back of her hand against her eyes. Took a breath. Took another. She didn't hear the door. Callum had not intended to go to the library. He had intended to go to bed at a reasonable hour, which was something he had been intending to do for approximately 3 weeks and had not once managed. He had been on his way down the corridor, passing the library door, when he had noticed the light beneath it, amber, warm, the particular glow of 3 lamps, and had stopped. It was past 10. The house was quiet. He opened the door. She was at the reading table, her back to him, her shoulders doing something wrong. He understood immediately, before he could see her face, before he could see the papers spread on the table, the particular language of someone trying very hard not to make a sound. He crossed the room without deciding to. He was halfway to the table when she heard him and went absolutely still. He watched her hands move, one pressing flat on the papers, one moving to her face, and the effort it took her to compose herself in the 3 seconds before she turned. She turned. Her eyes were red. Her face was composed. The composure was working hard. He looked at her and didn't say anything, not "Are you all right?" because plainly she wasn't, not "What happened?" because the papers on the table were explanation enough. He looked at the documents. He recognized the partnership format immediately. He had seen enough of his father's business arrangements to know one on sight. He looked at the date, 1881. He looked at the name at the top. Edmund Voss. He looked at Alara. She had pressed her lips together in the way she did when she was deciding what to say, and he could see the calculation happening, the measuring, the careful distribution of information, the instinct she developed for holding things back. "You don't have to explain it," he said quietly. She looked at him. "I know what it is," he said. "Or enough of it." He pulled the second chair from against the wall and sat down beside her, not across the table, where there would have been distance and formality, but beside her, the way you sat beside someone when the moment didn't have room for distance. He looked at both documents. He looked at them for a long time. The forgery was evident to him within 30 seconds. He had been going through his father's papers for 2 years and he knew the signatures well enough, the authentic ones and the ones his father had arranged to look authentic. He had found 2 others. He had not known about this one. "He forged it," Callum said. Statement, not question. "Yes. And the original was always in this library," she said. "Filed under miscellaneous household correspondence. No one ever looked. The fire had burned low. One of the lamps was beginning to gutter." "Your father," Callum said slowly. "He knew." "I think so." "Yes. And he let it go." Her voice was steady. "Barely. He was advised to." The cost of a legal challenge, the Ashford name, he was tired. She stopped. He died the following winter. The room was very quiet. Callum looked at the document in his hand, at Edmund Voss's real signature, the 7 with its particular slant, the annealed margins, and felt something move through him that was not comfortable and was not supposed to be comfortable. His father. He had loved his father, or had loved the version of his father that existed in early mornings and writing lessons and the specific pride of a man watching his son learn something new. That man had also been this man, the one who forged signatures and removed ledger pages and filed inconvenient agreements under miscellaneous household correspondence. Both things were true. He had known that for 2 years. It did not get easier. He set the document down carefully. Then he did the thing he had not planned to do and could not, afterward, have explained as a decision. He reached over and put his hand over hers where it lay on the table. Not her hand exactly. The back of it. His fingers over her fingers, very still. She went absolutely rigid for a fraction of a second. Then she didn't. She looked down at their hands and then she looked at the wall and she took one breath that was not steady and one that was, and then she pressed her eyes closed for just a moment, not hiding, he thought, just resting. The way you closed your eyes when you had been holding something for a very long time and someone had, for a moment, offered to help hold it. He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that wasn't smaller than the moment. The lamp guttered again. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. The fire made the soft, collapsing sound of old wood settling into ash. He sat beside her and kept his hand over hers and let the silence be what it was, not empty, not uncomfortable, not filled with things unsaid. Just present. The two of them, and 2 documents, and the truth of what his father had done, and the particular weight of a grief that had been carried alone for too long. After a while, he didn't know how long, she turned her hand over. Just slightly. So that her fingers were no longer underneath his but beside them. Not pulling away. Not holding on. Just, beside. He looked at her profile. She was looking at the document still, but her face had changed, the composure was real now, not worked at, the kind that came after something had been acknowledged rather than suppressed. "I have a copy," she said quietly. "Of the original terms. I reconstructed it from memory. I've had it since before I came here." "How long did it take you to memorize it?" "I was in the room when it was drawn up. I was 17 and I was supposed to be reading." He thought about a 17-year-old girl sitting in a corner, listening to every clause of a contract with the attention of someone who didn't yet know why it would matter. "Your father let you stay," he said. "He always said I had a better head for contracts than most men twice his age." A pause. He was right. He was, Callum said. He was absolutely right. She looked at him then. He looked back. The lamplight was very close. The room was very quiet. They were sitting near enough that he could see the ink stain on the inside of her right wrist, the red rim of her eyes that the composure hadn't quite erased, the particular steadiness of a person who had decided to keep going and meant it. He was aware, with a clarity that was not convenient, that he was looking at her the way he had been trying not to look at her for weeks. And that she knew it. And that she was not looking away. He thought about Isabella. About February. About £47,000. He thought about a stable at midnight and a hand on an iron latch, and the numbers don't change depending on the time of day. "Ilara," he said. She didn't move. Didn't answer. Just waited, with that quality she had of making space for what came next without trying to fill it prematurely. "When this is resolved," he stopped. Started again. "When the documents are established and the estate is on its feet and all of it." "Don't," she said softly. Not unkindly. Not yet. He understood. The situation had too many moving pieces still. Isabella. His mother. The steward, who had removed the ledger pages and would not do so quietly if cornered. The creditors who were not yet satisfied. Not yet. Right, he said. But, she said, and she looked at the documents on the table rather than at him, when you said you intended to make it right. A pause. I believed you. The fire had gone to embers. 3 lamps, 2 documents, a library full of a dead man's secrets. Good, he said. Hold on to that. She looked at him one more time. Something passed across her face, not the composed version, not the careful version, just the real one, brief and unguarded, and then she looked away. I'm going to need the estate office tomorrow, she said. Early. Before your steward arrives. I'll have the key left on the hall table. And the 1886 and 1887 correspondence files are still missing. Someone took them from this room. If they're not in the estate office. The steward has a private office above the coach house, Callum said. Has done for 12 years. It's never been audited. She went very still. Has anyone ever asked why? No, he said. No one ever thought to. She pressed her lips together. He could see the calculation running, the pieces rearranging, the picture sharpening. Your Grace, she said. Callum, he said. I think you've earned it. She looked at him. He could see her weigh it, the way she weighed everything, not casually, but seriously, as though names were also a kind of contract. Callum, she said finally. It was just a word. His name, which he had heard 10,000 times, from his mother and his solicitor and his tenants and his peers. It was not the same word. We need to move quickly, she said. Isabella is looking. Whatever she finds, she'll use. I know. And your mother. My mother, he said, is more complicated than she appears. Leave her to me. Ilara nodded. She gathered the documents with careful hands, the original agreement, the forged letter, and folded them precisely and tucked them inside her ledger. She stood. He stood. They were close, as they had been close before, the particular proximity of a small circle of lamplight in a large room. He was aware of it. She was aware of it. Neither of them moved for one moment too long. Then she picked up her ledger and stepped back and said, "Good night, not your grace, not any title, just the word," and walked to the door. At the door she paused, her back to him. "The mare," she said. "The one who was afraid of the bucket." He waited. "She's not afraid anymore," Ilara said. "In case you were wondering." She left. He stood in the library for a long time, looking at the place on the table where her hands had been, listening to the house settle around him in the dark. Then he went to his study and wrote a letter to his solicitor. He also wrote, in the small hours, a second letter, to Lord Alderton's eldest son, who had recently come into his father's estate and who had, Callum suspected, inherited more than a title. He sent both letters before dawn. He did not sleep. The letter arrived on a Friday. Not to Callum. To his mother. Eleanor brought it to breakfast herself, which was unusual, because Eleanor did not typically carry her own correspondence to the table. She sat down, poured her tea, and placed the letter beside her plate with the careful precision of a woman who had already read it twice and was deciding how to use it. Callum looked at the envelope. He recognized the Vane family seal. "Isabella writes that she would like to call this afternoon," Eleanor said. "At 4. She says she has something she wishes to discuss with the family." "The family," Callum repeated. Her word. He reached for his coffee. Did she say what it concerns? She did not, Eleanor said. She did not need to. She picked up her own cup and looked at him over it, the particular look she reserved for moments when she was telling him something without saying it, which was, he had always thought, the most efficient form of communication she had ever developed. He understood. I see, he said. 4 o'clock, his mother said. Please be punctual. He went to find Alara immediately after breakfast. She was in the estate office. She had been there since 6, he knew, because the key had been taken from the hall table before he came downstairs. He knocked once and entered. She was at the desk with 3 files open and her ledger beside her and the particular focused stillness of someone in the middle of something important. She looked up. Read his expression. How long do we have, she said. Until 4 o'clock. She looked at the clock on the mantel. 6 hours and some minutes. The coach house office, she said. We need it today. Agreed. Garrett can keep the steward occupied in the yard, there's a delivery expected this morning. An hour, perhaps. An hour is enough. She was already closing the files in a specific order, a system he had learned meant she was cataloging what she'd found rather than simply tidying. I found the payment records. He came to the desk. She opened the ledger to a page she'd marked with a folded corner, her neat columns of figures, cross-referenced to document numbers. Your father made 4 payments to the steward, she said. Asterisk, between 1886 and 1888. Recorded here as household maintenance. They are not household maintenance. The amounts correspond exactly to, asterisk, she pointed to a line, the removal of files and the preparation of the substituted documents. Callum looked at the figures. He paid him, he said. Asterisk, consistently. And the steward has been, asterisk, she paused, choosing the word with care, banking on the arrangement remaining undisturbed. Which is why the original documents were filed here and not destroyed. He wanted leverage, Callum said. He wanted insurance, she said. There's a difference. Leverage is active. Insurance is waiting, he said. Yes. He looked at the figures again. At his father's name, and a number, and a date. If Isabella has found the payment records. She hasn't, Alara said. These were in the estate office, bottom right drawer, underneath a land survey from 1879. She doesn't have access to the estate office. A pause. But she's clever enough to have found something else. What? The debt itself, she said. The full amount, and its origin. She would have had access to your solicitor's filings through her father's connections. Sir William has known your family solicitor for 20 years. She looked at him. She knows about the 47,000. She knows it came partly from your father's arrangements. And she knows that the arrangements were not straightforward. Enough to use, he said. Enough to threaten, she said. Which is what this afternoon is. He sat down in the chair across from her. The estate office was quiet, the particular quiet of a room full of numbers that had been pretending to be something other than what they were for a long time. Outside, he could hear the delivery cart arriving in the yard. Garrett's voice, unhurried, directing. The coach house office, he said. Now, while the steward is occupied. She was already standing. The coach house office was small and cold and smelled of old ledgers and linseed oil. Alara found the correspondence files in 12 minutes. Not because they were obvious, they weren't. They had been placed inside a box labeled Carriage Maintenance Records 1885 to 1892, which was, she granted, a reasonably intelligent hiding place in a coach house. But the box was the only one on the shelf that had been dusted recently, which meant it had been accessed recently, which meant it mattered. She opened it. Both files, intact. She checked the contents with rapid, practiced hands, not reading, just confirming structure, checking for removals. Intact, she said. Callum was at the doorway, watching the yard. Are you certain? The page numbering is continuous. Nothing has been removed. She turned to the 1887 file, found the March section, and stopped. What is it? He said, without turning. She didn't answer for a moment. There's a letter, she said. From your father. To the steward. Dated November 1887. What does it say? She read it. Then she read it again. It instructs him, she said slowly, to return the original Voss documents to the library. To file them as miscellaneous household correspondence. And to, she paused, to ensure that Miss Ilara Voss, should she ever seek employment in Yorkshire, was given a position at Ashford Hall. The yard was quiet except for Garrett's voice and the cart horses' patient shifting. Callum turned from the doorway. She looked at him. He knew, she said. Your father. At the end. He knew what he had done. She thought about the late Duke, a man she had constructed entirely from documents and consequences and a forged signature. A man who had been, in her mind, simply the shape of the harm he had caused. This was a different shape. Not a better man. Not redeemed. But one who had, at the end, tried to leave a door open. Who had kept the original documents rather than burning them and had, in his own oblique and cowardly and entirely insufficient way, tried to point someone toward them. She wasn't sure what to do with that. She filed it away, carefully, to think about later. Take the files, Callum said. She took them. She had an hour before 4 o'clock. She used it well. By 3:30, she had compiled a complete record, the original partnership agreement, the payment records, the 1887 letter, the deed reference, and a 4-year restructuring plan for the estate debt that did not require £47,000 of dowry money. She set it on the reading table in the library and looked at it. It was, she thought, enough. Whether it was enough for today was a different question. At 4 o'clock, Isabella arrived. She came alone, not even Miss Price, which was itself information. This was not a social call requiring the performance of propriety. This was a meeting. Eleanor received her in the blue parlor. Callum was already there, standing by the window. Ilara had not been invited, which was, she understood, exactly as Isabella intended. She sat in the library and listened to the clock and worked on the restructuring plan and did not think about what was being said 30 feet away. She thought about it constantly. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. She heard Isabella leave, the particular sound of heels on the hall floor that had a purpose to it, a rhythm of someone who had done what they came to do. Then silence. Then Callum's footsteps in the corridor. He opened the library door and came in and closed it behind him and stood for a moment with his back against it, looking at the ceiling. She set down her pen. Tell me, she said. He pushed off the door and came to the table and sat down. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been handed something heavy and was working out which muscles to use. She knows about the debt, he said. The full amount. The origin. She has documentation, I don't know how she obtained it, but it's credible. He paused. She also knows that the estate's financial arrangements between 1881 and 1888 were, she used the word, irregular. She doesn't have the specific documents. But she has enough to imply them, and implication, in London society. Is sufficient, Ilara said. Yes. What does she want? He looked at the table. The wedding, he said. Not spring. Not February. He paused. 3 weeks. Elara was very still. 3 weeks, she said. The engagement announcement is scheduled for the 15th. She wants the ceremony to follow within the month. He looked up. If I don't agree, she goes to her father, who goes to the primary creditor, who calls the debt in full. Immediately. Immediately, she repeated. Within 30 days. She looked at her restructuring plan. The 4-year timeline. The carefully assembled logic of it. 30 days was not 4 years. And if the debt is called, she said, working through it aloud, the estate is insolvent within the month. Yes. And the Voss claim would be buried under the insolvency proceedings, he said. By the time it was resolved, if it was resolved, there would be nothing left to return. She pressed her fingers flat on the table. The afternoon light was going gray. The library was very quiet. She thought about 3 weeks. About what could be done in 3 weeks with the documents she had and the plan she'd built and a restructuring proposal that required a creditor's goodwill she didn't yet have. She thought about what could not be done in 3 weeks. Did she threaten anything else? Elara asked. He was quiet for a moment. She said, he said carefully, that a young woman of uncertain origin living unchaperoned in a duke's household, regardless of the family connection story, would not survive the scrutiny of a public scandal. The words landed in the room with a particular weight. Elara understood precisely what Isabella meant. Not physical harm. Social annihilation, the swift, comprehensive kind that London society enacted without effort and without apology, the kind that closed doors and ended livelihoods and left women with no name and no money in a city with very few options for such women. She means me, Elara said. Yes. She would do it. Yes, he said. I believe she would. She looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression that was controlled and careful, and underneath both of those things, she could see, he could not quite hide it, something that was neither controlled nor careful. Callum, she said. I'm not going to let that happen, he said. Very quiet. Very certain. You may not have a choice. There is always a choice. The estate. The estate is a collection of buildings and land, he said. It can be sold. It can be restructured. It can be reduced and rebuilt and, he stopped. Pressed his hand flat on the table, beside her papers. What it cannot do is make the last 11 months worth nothing. What it cannot do is... He stopped again. The room held the silence. She looked at his hand on the table. At the line of his jaw. At the thing he wasn't finishing. What it cannot do, she said softly, completing it for him, is justify what your father did. He looked at her. No, he said. It cannot. She took a breath. 3 weeks, she said. Give me 3 weeks. Elara. Not to solve everything. Not to fix every piece of it. She turned to her restructuring plan. But to give you something to stand on. Something real, that doesn't require her money and doesn't depend on her silence. She looked at him. I have the documents. I have the payment records. I have the plan. I need 3 weeks to make it credible to a creditor. And if it's not enough, then at the end of 3 weeks you'll know precisely what you have, she said. And you can make a clear decision with clear information. Which is, she said, more than you have now. He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, the gray afternoon was turning toward evening. The stable yard was quiet. Somewhere in the house, she could hear Eleanor moving, the particular footsteps of a woman walking slowly, thinking. 3 weeks, he said. 3 weeks. He nodded once. Then he looked at the documents spread across the table, the plan, the records, the original agreement in her father's handwriting, and she watched something settle in him. Not resolution, not yet. But the particular stillness of a man who has decided on a direction. "What do you need from me?" he said. She turned to a clean page in her ledger. "Lord Alderton's son," she said. "Did he respond to your letter?" "This morning. He's willing to meet." "Good." She began to write. "And the primary creditor, what's his temperament? Patient or impatient?" "Patient, if he believes he'll be paid. Then we can work with him." She kept writing. "And your steward? What about him?" She looked up. "He needs to be addressed," she said. "Before any of the rest of it. Because if Isabella doesn't find him, he'll find her, and a man protecting himself is a man with nothing to lose." Callum's expression did not change. "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about that. And I think," he said, "that a man who has been paid once to be dishonest can be paid again to be honest. Provided the incentive is correctly structured." She looked at him. "That's quite pragmatic," she said. "I've been learning from someone pragmatic," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. She looked back at her ledger before it could become more than that. "3 weeks," she said again. "One problem at a time." "One problem at a time," he agreed. She wrote. He sat across from her and looked at the plan she'd built, and outside the Yorkshire evening came down cold and indifferent over a house full of secrets that were, for the first time in a long time, beginning to come into the light. He left the library at 7. At the door, he paused. She had come to notice this, the way he paused at doors, as though exits required one more thing. "She doesn't know," he said, "what you actually are." She looked up. "What do you mean?" "Isabella. She thinks she's threatening a woman with no options." He looked at her steadily. "She doesn't know about the plan. The documents. What you've built." "No," Ilara agreed. "She doesn't." "Good," he said. "Let's keep it that way." He left. She sat alone in the library and looked at 3 weeks of work still ahead of her and felt, settling over the fear and the calculation and the old grief and the new impossible thing she was not yet naming, something that was, despite everything, almost like certainty. She picked up her pen. 3 weeks is not a long time. Unless you are living inside them, in which case 3 weeks can contain approximately the weight of a year. Ilara learned this in the way she learned most things, by moving through it, by keeping her head down and her pen moving and her attention on the next problem and the one after that, and by not, under any circumstances, allowing herself to look up long enough to notice how much she had begun to dread the end of it. The first week was logistics. Lord Alderton's son, a young man named Frederick, recently come into his father's estate and slightly overwhelmed by it, which made him, in Ilara's assessment, precisely the kind of person who responded well to clear information presented without condescension, met with Callum on a Tuesday. Ilara prepared the materials. She did not attend the meeting. She sat in the library and worked on the creditor proposal and listened, at 7 in the evening, to Callum's footsteps coming down the corridor with a pace that was different from his usual pace. She looked up when he entered. "He has letters," Callum said. "From his father. 3 of them. 2 reference the arrangement with Voss directly." She set down her pen. "And? He's willing to provide them. He wants," Callum paused. "He wants the estate to acknowledge his father's role. Publicly, if possible. A record in the parliamentary filings." She thought about this. "That's reasonable. I thought so too. It also helps us," she said. Independent corroboration from a named witness, even a posthumous one, changes the legal weight of the original agreement considerably. Yes. He sat down. He also said something else. She waited. He said his father spoke of Edmund Voss with, he used the word admiration. He said his father always believed Voss had been wronged and had never known how to correct it. Callum looked at the table. He seemed relieved. To be correcting it now. She looked at her ledger. Her father had been admired. Had been spoken of, in another man's house, with something like regret. She thought about the 14th of October and the wax-pale solicitor and let herself, just for a moment, feel the particular comfort of that. Then she pressed it down and picked up her pen. The creditor meeting, she said. When? Thursday. Then we need the restructuring proposal finalized by Wednesday evening. I know. And the steward. Handled, Callum said. She looked up. He resigned this morning, Callum said. Effective immediately. With a settlement that reflects his long service and his willingness to provide a signed account of the 1886 and 1887 arrangements. He agreed to that? He agreed to that. A pause. I was, as you suggested, correctly incentivized. She considered this. What did it cost? Less than a court case, he said. More than he deserved. She noted it in the ledger. Filed it. Moved on. The second week was the creditor. His name was Mr. Harcastle, a self-made man, which Callum had mentioned as though it were merely biographical and which Alara had filed as significant, because self-made men generally had a different relationship with numbers than men who had inherited them. They knew what numbers actually meant. They had felt them. She prepared for the meeting as she prepared for everything, thoroughly, specifically, and with the assumption that she would not be in the room. She was correct about that. Women did not attend creditor meetings. This was simply the shape of the world. She gave Callum everything he needed. Every figure, every projection, every supporting document, cross-referenced and tabbed and ordered in the sequence she judged most persuasive. She also gave him, on a single page, the core argument in plain language, not the version for lawyers, not the version for solicitors, but the version for a man who had built something from nothing and understood, in his bones, the difference between a debt that couldn't be paid and a debt that simply hadn't been structured correctly. Read that page last, she told him. After the figures. When he's already seen the plan works. Why last? Because the figures will tell him it's possible, she said. That page will tell him it's worth believing in. She paused. Those are different things. He looked at the page. Read it. You wrote this for him specifically, he said. I wrote it for a man who built something and knows what it costs, she said. If I'm right about him, it'll land. He looked up from the page at her. What if you're wrong about him? Then the figures still work, she said. But I'm not wrong. He held her gaze for a moment, that particular look he had, the one that wasn't quite a smile but lived in the same neighborhood. No, he said. You rarely are. She looked at her ledger. Go to bed. The meeting's at 9. He came back from the meeting at 2 in the afternoon. She knew the outcome before he said anything. She had learned to read him, over 3 weeks of close quarters and shared problems, in the specific way you learn to read someone when you were paying very close attention and trying not to show it. The set of his shoulders. The pace of his step. He sat down across from her and put the file on the table and said, 4 years. Fixed rate. He wants quarterly reports. He said he'd like them prepared by whoever prepared this proposal. She looked at the file. He asked about the proposal, Callum said. Who wrote it? I told him a financial consultant engaged by the estate. That's accurate enough. He said it was the clearest restructuring document he'd seen in 20 years of lending. She was quiet for a moment. 4 years, she said. 4 years. The £47,000. The death sentence delivered across a mahogany desk. 4 years instead of a spring deadline, instead of Lady Isabella Vane's dowry, instead of a marriage that sat on everyone's shoulders like something very heavy pretending to be an arrangement. She looked at the file and felt something move through her that she had not allowed herself to feel for most of 11 months. Right, she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. Right, he said. He was watching her. She picked up the file and opened it and looked at the terms and kept her face exactly as composed as she needed it to be, which was, she acknowledged privately, not perfectly composed at all. The third week was Isabella. Callum met with her on a Monday. Ilara did not know exactly what was said. She knew the shape of it. He had the documents now, the original agreement and the Alderton letters and the steward signed account, and the creditor arrangement that made the dowry unnecessary, and he laid it out, she imagined, with the same directness he had used on everything else he had decided to be honest about. She imagined Isabella's face. She found she did not feel triumphant. She felt, instead, the particular tiredness that came after a long period of sustained effort, not unpleasant, but profound. The tiredness of someone who had been holding something up for a very long time and had, very recently, been allowed to set part of it down. Callum returned at 6 in the evening. He came to the library. He sat down. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. She's withdrawing from the engagement, he said. Her father is, not happy. But the documents make a challenge inadvisable, and Sir William Vane is, above everything, a man who doesn't take losing positions. And the threat? About me? Gone with the engagement. He looked at her. She has nothing to gain from it now. Ilara nodded. Your mother, she said. I spoke to her this morning. And? He was quiet for a moment. She knew, he said. About your family. She suspected, I think, from the night of the stable, when you said your father's name. She knew Edmund Voss. He paused. She didn't know about the forgery. She knew her husband had made arrangements that were, she knew more than she said, and less than she should have. Is she? She is, he said carefully, a woman processing several things simultaneously. She will be, I think, all right. Eventually. Ilara looked at the window. Outside, the stable yard was dark and quiet and the tree line was a black shape against a charcoal sky. So, she said. So, he said. The fire was burning well. The library was warm. The reading table had, for the first time since Ilara had been using it, no crisis on it, no urgent documents, no creditor notices, no forged letters. Just her ledger, closed, and a lamp burning steadily. The Derbyshire properties, she said. My solicitor has the documents. The claim is strong, he says within 6 months, possibly less. And the smaller claim? The interest on the original loan? Will be settled from the estate. I've already instructed him. He looked at her. It won't be everything your father was owed. But it will be what the law allows. She pressed her lips together. It's enough, she said. Is it? She thought about what enough meant. Not the figure, the meaning underneath it. Yes, she said. It is. They sat for a while in the quiet, which had a different quality than the quiet of the previous weeks. Those quiets had been full, of pressure, of calculation, of things unsaid because there was no time to say them yet. This quiet had room in it. She was aware of that room. She was aware of him being aware of it. She picked up her ledger and opened it to a clean page, out of habit, the reflex of a woman who filled silence with work. "Ilara," he said. She stopped. "You've been doing that for 3 weeks," he said. Opening the ledger when the conversation becomes productive, she said. "I was going to say something else." "I know what you were going to say." "Do you?" She looked at the clean page. The lamplight on the white paper. The ink stain on her right wrist. "You were going to say something that we agreed wasn't appropriate to say until things were resolved," she said. "And things are now resolved." And, she stopped. "And," he said quietly. "And I don't know what to do with that," she said. "I have spent 11 months knowing exactly what to do. I have had a plan and a purpose and a next step in." She pressed the ledger closed. "And now I don't. And it's very uncomfortable," he said. "Yes." "Good," he said. She looked at him. "I find it reassuring," he said, "that you also find this uncomfortable. I've been uncomfortable for considerably longer than 3 weeks and it's been entirely unreasonable." She looked at him for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed, a real one, brief and surprised, the kind that escaped before you could compose it. It changed the room entirely. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen before, unguarded, warm, entirely without the careful management he usually applied. Just him, in the lamplight, looking at her as though she were the most interesting thing he had ever found in a library. She felt it move through her, the thing she had been pressing down for weeks, the thing she had told herself was impractical and dangerous and beside the point. It moved through her and she let it, for the length of one breath, be exactly what it was. Then she said, "The restructuring reports. Hardcastle wants them quarterly. Ilara. Someone needs to prepare them. The estate will need a financial advisor, a proper one, with a proper arrangement, not a Ilara. Stable hand with a ledger and a Ilara." He said it a third time, and there was something in it that stopped her entirely. Not a command. Something quieter than that. A request. She stopped. He stood up. Came around the table, slowly, the way he had moved toward the frightened mare, without sudden motion, giving her all the time she needed. He stopped in front of her. She looked up at him. He was close enough that she could see the firelight in his eyes, the slight tiredness at the corners of them, the particular expression of a man who had decided something and was no longer pretending otherwise. "The restructuring reports," he said, "are going to be excellent. I have every confidence." "Good," she said. Her voice came out very even, which was impressive under the circumstances. "And the estate will need a financial advisor," he said. "With a proper arrangement." "Yes." "And there will be quarterly meetings with Hardcastle." "Yes." "And the Derbyshire claim will resolve in 6 months." "Probably." "And in all of that," he said, "which is going to take some time, there is no version of it in which I can continue to pretend that the person I most want in the room for every part of it is not also the person He stopped. She waited. She had learned to wait for what he hadn't finished. "The person I think about," he said, "when I am not thinking about creditors or documents or the East Wing or any of the rest of it. Which is, less often than it should be." The fire shifted. The lamp burned steady. She looked at him, the long, honest look she had been not giving herself permission to give, the one that acknowledged everything she had been noting and filing and telling herself was irrelevant. The line of him. The steadiness. The way he had sat beside her in this room with his hand over hers and not said a single useless word. "I have ink on my hands," she said. "Permanently, at this point." "I know," he said. "I find it entirely Don't say charming, she said. I was going to say honest, he said. But charming is also accurate. She looked at him for one more moment. Then she stood up. They were very close. The same proximity as the stall entrance, as the lamplit stable, as every careful almost moment of the past weeks, but this time there was no iron latch, no door, no Yusak with a knock, no crisis requiring immediate attention. Just the room. The fire. The space between them, which was very small. Callum, she said. Yes. If you're going to say something. I wasn't going to say something, he said. She looked up at him. I was, he said quietly, going to do something. She held his gaze. All right, she said. He raised one hand and tucked a strand of hair back from her face, carefully, slowly, the backs of his fingers just barely grazing her cheekbone, and then he leaned down and kissed her. Not tentative. Not brief. The kind of kiss that had been waiting for 11 months in stables and late nights and creditor meetings and hands on iron latches, the kind that had accumulated weight through every restrained moment and every careful almost, and was now, finally, exactly what it was. She kissed him back. Her ink-stained hand came up and pressed flat against his chest, and she felt his heart doing something that was not at all the steady, measured pace of a man who was composed. He was not composed. Neither was she. The fire crackled. The lamp burned. Outside, the Yorkshire night was cold and indifferent and entirely unaware that something in the house on the hill had, after a very long time, come right. They stood in the library for a while after. Not speaking, not needing to. Her hand still against his chest. His forehead resting against hers. The particular quiet of two people who have said the most important thing and are in no hurry to move on from it. The engagement announcement, she said eventually. It's still scheduled for the 15th. Yes, he said. That's 5 days. Yes. Callum. I know, he said. I know what it means. I know what it will cost. He lifted his head and looked at her. I also know that I have been making decisions based on what things cost for 2 years, and I would like, for once, to make one based on what it's worth. She looked at him. There will be a scandal, she said. You understand that. There will be approximately 3 months of dinner party conversation, he said. And then something else will happen and there will be 3 months of conversation about that. London has a short memory for everything except grudges, and I don't intend to give anyone a grudge. The House of Lords can manage, he said. I have, as it turns out, an excellent financial advisor. The corner of her mouth moved. She's going to want a proper arrangement, Alara said. This advisor. Not a stable and a borrowed room. I had in mind something considerably more permanent, he said. If she's willing. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. Somewhere in the house, a clock struck 11. Ask me properly, she said. When the time is right. Not tonight. Not tonight, he agreed. But, she paused. Yes. He looked at her. Yes, she said again. When you ask. The answer is yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then he did something she had not expected. He brought her ink-stained hand up and pressed his mouth to the inside of her wrist, very gently, right over the stain. Right, he said. Good. She lay in the blue room that night and looked at the familiar ceiling and listened to the house settle and thought about yes. It was a small word for the size of what it contained. She thought about her father. About the 14th of October, and the rain, and a teacup set down carefully. About a 17-year-old girl in a corner, listening, not knowing yet that she was memorizing something she would one day need. She thought about 11 months of hay and cold mornings and numbers that nobody else read. She thought about a hand on an iron latch, and a frightened mare, and the numbers don't change depending on the time of day. She pressed the back of her hand against her mouth. Then she turned over, and closed her eyes, and slept better than she had in over a year. The 15th arrived with the particular indifference of important days. No dramatic weather. No sign from the universe. Just a grey December morning in Yorkshire, frost on the stable yard cobblestones, a fire laid early in every room, and the slow, inexorable gathering of approximately 80 people who had driven or ridden or taken the train from London and various surrounding counties to witness the formal engagement announcement of the Duke of Ashford. They came because they had been invited. They stayed because, by mid-morning, something in the air of Ashford Hall had the particular quality of a room in which something was about to happen that nobody had planned for. People who had been attending society events for decades knew that quality. They couldn't have named it. But they stayed close to the refreshments and kept their ears available. Elara was dressed by 7. Not in her own clothes, Eleanor had seen to that, 3 days ago, with the brisk efficiency of a woman who had decided on a position and was implementing it. The dress was dark green, simple, well cut. Not a statement. Not an apology. Just correct. Eleanor had brought it herself. Had set it on the bed without ceremony and said, "You'll need something appropriate." Elara had looked at her. "Your Grace." "My husband," Eleanor said, "was not a good man. In all the ways that matter, he was not a good man." She smoothed the dress with one hand, not looking at Elara. "I knew more than I said and less than I should have, and I have been thinking about that for 3 weeks. A pause. "I am not asking for your forgiveness. I am telling you that I know what my son is doing and I am not standing in the way of it." She left before Elara could answer. Elara had stood in the blue room for a long time after that, her hand on the green dress, thinking about what it cost a proud woman to say a thing like that and mean it. She came downstairs at 9. The house was already filling, carriages in the drive, voices in the hall, the organized chaos of a staff managing more guests than the rooms were designed for simultaneously. She moved through it quietly, the way she moved through most things, noted and not noted, present without announcing herself. She found the library empty and went in. She stood at the window and looked at the stable yard. Frost on the cobblestones. The third stall window dark. A single stable lad crossing the yard with a bucket, breath clouding in the cold. She had not been back to the stable since the blue room. She had not needed to be. But she looked at it now and thought about November, how long ago it seemed, how completely different this morning was from the first morning she had opened her eyes in this house and thought, information is the only currency available to a woman with nothing. She still believed that. But she had revised, somewhat, the definition of nothing. "You're not in the hall." She turned. Callum was in the doorway. Dressed correctly, dark coat, white cravat, the full performance of a duke on a formal occasion. He looked, as he always looked in these clothes, slightly contained by them. "Neither are you," she said. He came in. Came to the window and stood beside her, looking at the stable yard. "How are you?" he asked. "Calm," she said. "You?" "Also calm," he said. "Surprisingly." She looked at his profile. "Is it surprising?" "A month ago I thought this morning would feel like a trap closing," he said. "It doesn't." "What does it feel like?" He thought about it. "Like the correct move," he said. "After a very long game." She looked back at the stable yard. "Callum," she said. "Whatever happens in that room today, whatever people say, whatever it costs, I need you to be certain. Not for me. For yourself. I am certain. You're about to stand in front of 80 people, Anne. I know what I'm about to do, he said. I've known for longer than you think. He turned to look at her. I was certain in a stable at 11:30. I was certain at a reading table with a creditor's bill between us. I was certain in the coach house and the estate office and every other place we have had this conversation obliquely. He paused. I am quite thoroughly certain, Ilara. You don't need to check. She held his gaze. All right, she said. All right, he said. They stood at the window a moment longer. Then he offered his arm, formally, correctly, as he would offer it to any guest. She took it. They walked out of the library and into the noise of the house. The announcement was scheduled for 11 o'clock. The great hall had been arranged for it, chairs set in rows, a small raised area at the front where the family would stand, flowers that had arrived from London the previous day and smelled incongruously of summer. 80 people arranged themselves with the practiced ease of a class accustomed to events. Isabella was there. Ilara saw her across the room, standing with her father, composed and still and wearing a shade of blue that was, objectively, very effective. She looked like a woman who had calculated the optics of this morning very carefully and dressed accordingly. Their eyes met briefly. Isabella inclined her head. Just slightly. The acknowledgement of one chess player to another, at the end of a game. Ilara inclined her head in return. Then she found a place at the edge of the room, in the third row, where she could see the front clearly. She folded her hands in her lap. She breathed. Eleanor came first. She stood to the right of the raised area, straight-backed, composed, in charcoal gray. She looked at the room with the expression of a woman who had prepared for this morning and intended to weather it with dignity. She also looked, briefly, across the room at Ilara. Not with warmth, exactly. With something more complicated than warmth. With the expression of a woman who was doing, in this moment, the best she could with what she understood, and knew it was imperfect, and was doing it anyway. Ilara held her gaze. Eleanor looked back to the front. Callum came in at 11 precisely. The room did the thing rooms do when the person everyone has come to see arrives, a slight shift, a collective attention, the turning of faces. He walked to the front with the unhurried authority of a man in his own house, and Ilara, watching from the third row, thought, he looks like himself today. Not the dinner performance, not the managed version, not the man wearing a coat that didn't quite fit. Just himself. He stood at the front. Looked at the room. His eyes found her immediately. She had not expected that, had not expected him to look for her first, before his mother, before anything else. But he did. Directly, without hesitation, as though he had known exactly where she was. She gave the smallest nod. He looked back at the room. Thank you, he said, for coming. I am grateful to you all. His voice carried without effort. The room was very quiet, the particular quiet of 80 people who have been at enough of these events to know the shape of them and are waiting for the expected next part. He paused. I had intended this morning to be a formal engagement announcement, he said. I find that I cannot make it that. The quality of the quiet changed. A woman in the second row turned to look at her neighbor. Sir William Vane, beside Isabella, went very still. Callum continued. This estate has been in my family for 4 generations. In that time, it has accumulated, alongside its history and its land and its considerable collection of unsorted correspondence, a brief pause, and Ilara heard 2 people near her almost laugh, a number of debts. Financial, and otherwise. He looked at the room. I have spent 2 years managing the financial ones. I intend to spend considerably longer addressing the others. He paused. Many of you knew my father. He was a man of considerable charm and considerable capacity for arrangement. Some of those arrangements were not, as I have recently and thoroughly discovered, conducted with integrity. The room was entirely still. Sir William Vane had gone a particular shade of controlled. Isabella was looking at Callum with an expression that was not surprise. She had known, Ilara thought, that something like this was possible. She had gambled on the debt being the stronger lever. She had, in the end, miscalculated one variable. She had miscalculated Ilara. Specifically, Callum said, I wish to make publicly known that a private financial arrangement made in 1881 between my father and a Mr. Edmund Voss of Derbyshire was conducted fraudulently. The partnership records were falsified. The Voss family lost 3 properties as a result. I have, in the past 3 weeks, secured the original documentation, independent corroboration, and a legal remedy. The matter is with my solicitor. The murmuring started then, low, immediate, the particular sound of 80 people processing something they did not expect. Callum let it settle. I also wish to introduce someone, he said. Properly, this time. He looked across the room. Directly at Ilara. She felt it before she fully understood it, the shift of the room's attention, 80 heads turning, 80 pairs of eyes finding her in the 3rd row. She sat very still. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her spine was straight. She was, she told herself, a woman who had sat in worse rooms than this. She stood up. This, Callum said, is Miss Ilara Voss. Edmund Voss's daughter. She came to this estate 11 months ago under circumstances that I will not pretend were straightforward, and in those 11 months she has, among other things, restructured the estate's debt, identified and corrected 3 years of fraudulent yield reporting, located the original partnership documents, and prepared a financial recovery plan that has secured this estate's future without recourse to any marriage arrangement whatsoever. A pause. She is not my distant relation, he said. She is the most capable person I have ever met. And I intend, with her agreement and at her convenience, to ask her to remain at Ashford Hall permanently. In a capacity considerably more significant than library consultant. The room made a sound that was several things simultaneously. Isabella looked at Ilara one more time. The chess player look, final and complete. Then she turned away. Ilara stood in the 3rd row and looked at Callum and felt the weight of 80 people's attention and the cold December light through the tall windows and the particular, vertiginous sensation of a life reorganizing itself around a new center of gravity. He was looking at her. Not performing. Not managing. Just looking, the way he had looked across a stable at midnight at a woman with ink on her hands and a ledger in her lap, the way he had looked across a desk at a creditor's bill, the way he had looked in a lamplit library with his hand over hers. She looked back. The room waited. She walked forward. It was not a short distance, from the 3rd row to the front of the great hall was perhaps 30 feet, but it felt, under the weight of 80 people's silence, considerably longer. She walked steadily. Did not hurry. Did not look at the room. She looked at him. He extended his hand when she was close enough. She took it. The room erupted, not in disapproval, not entirely, though there was certainly that somewhere in the noise, but in the complicated, layered sound of 80 people responding to something that had not been on the program and was, undeniably, real. Lady Mortimer, in the 4th row, was applauding. He did not kiss her in the hall. That was not the moment for it, too much noise, too many people, too much that still needed settling. He held her hand and stood beside her and faced the room with the steady composure of a man who had made his decision and was not reconsidering it. She stood beside him and did the same. Later, after the room had finished its initial response, after Eleanor had crossed to them and taken Ilara's other hand briefly and said nothing, which was more than enough, after Sir William Vane had departed with Isabella in the lacquered carriage and the guests had separated into the configurations of people processing surprising information. Later, when the hall had thinned and the noise had settled to something manageable, he took her through the corridor and out the back of the house. Into the cold. They stood on the steps above the stable yard. December air. Frost still on the cobblestones, what the morning sun hadn't reached. He looked at the yard. She looked at the yard. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "That was." "Yes," he agreed. A pause. Lady Mortimer was applauding, she said. "She always had good judgment," he said. She turned to look at him. He turned to look at her. The December light was flat and clear and had no interest in being romantic, which made the moment, somehow, more real. Two people standing in cold air above a stable yard, having just done something irreversible, looking at each other with the particular expression of people who are not sorry. He raised his free hand and tucked a strand of hair back from her face. This time, he kissed her in the cold and the daylight and the full, unambiguous visibility of anyone who cared to look out a window at Ashford Hall, with no lamplight to soften it and no closed library door to contain it. Just the two of them. In the open. Finally. 2 years later. The debt was cleared in 22 months. Not 24, 22. Mr. Hardcastle noted this in a letter to his clerk, which the clerk filed under Ashford Estate, Model Restructuring, and which was subsequently referenced in 2 other client negotiations as an example of what correctly structured debt recovery could achieve when the figures were honestly prepared. He never met Miss Voss, Mrs. Ashford, by the time the letters exchanged were finished. But he sent a wedding gift. A leather-bound ledger, blank, with a note that said only, "For the next set of problems." She kept it on the desk in the estate office, which was now, officially, her office. The Derbyshire properties were returned in 7 months. Not all 3, one had been sold to a third party in good faith and the legal untangling was, as anticipated, complex. But the original farmhouse and the larger of the 2 lots came back with the title deed corrected and the parliamentary record amended and a formal acknowledgement, in the relevant filing, of the original Voss-Ashford partnership terms. Ilara read the filing 3 times when it arrived. Then she went for a long walk, alone, down to the south field where the harvest yield had been underreported for 3 years and was now, under a new and considerably more honest farm manager, running 30% above the historical average. She stood in the field for a while. She thought about her father. She thought about the 14th of October. About the rain. About a teacup set down carefully by a woman trying to be gentle with the china. She thought, "I found it, Papa. I found it and I brought it back. It wasn't everything. It couldn't be everything. He was not there to see it, and that was a loss she had learned to carry without pretending it was lighter than it was. But it was real. And it was right. And it was, in its way, enough." She walked back to the house. Frederick Alderton came to dinner twice in the first year. He was, it turned out, exactly as slightly overwhelmed by his inheritance as Ilara had initially assessed, and he benefited considerably from the quarterly estate management conversations that developed, over time, into something resembling genuine friendship. His father's letters had been submitted to the parliamentary record. His father's name appeared, in the relevant filing, as a witness to the original arrangement. He seemed relieved, Callum had said. He was. Visibly, consistently, in the way of someone who had inherited a guilt they hadn't caused and had been given the opportunity to correct it. Ilara liked him for that. The east wing was repaired in the 2nd year. Not all of it, the full restoration was a decade's project and they both knew it. But the worst of it, the structural problems that had been disguised as aesthetic choices for a decade, were addressed by a builder from Leeds who had the same quality Ilara most respected in people, he told them exactly what was wrong and exactly what it would cost and did not pretend otherwise. "Like someone else I know," Callum said, when she mentioned this. "I'm going to take that as a compliment," she said. "It is one," he said. Unambiguously. The proposal had happened on an ordinary Tuesday. Not a dramatic occasion, no formal arrangement, no ceremony. She had been at the desk in the estate office, going through the quarterly yields, and he had come in with 2 cups of tea and set one beside her and sat down in the chair across from her, which was where he sat when he had something to say. She had kept working. Quarterly numbers look good. "Ilara. Northfield is up again. I think we can." "Ilara." She looked up. He was looking at her across the desk with the expression she had come to know best, the one that was not performed, not managed, just him. "I have a question," he said. She set down her pen. "You said," he said, "when the time was right. To ask properly." She looked at him. "It's a Tuesday," she said. "It is," he agreed. "Is that a problem?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "Actually, I think I prefer it." "Good," he said. "Because I have been composing something considerably more elaborate for 3 weeks and it kept sounding like a creditor's notice." She laughed. "Ask the question, Callum." He asked the question. She gave the answer she had already given him, once, in a lamplit library at the end of 3 weeks that had contained approximately the weight of a year. Yes. The wedding was small. Intentionally. Ilara had no interest in a large occasion and Callum had even less, and Eleanor, who had, over 2 years, arrived at something that was not quite peace but was considerably more honest than its predecessor, agreed that a small wedding was, in the circumstances, correct. Lady Mortimer came. Frederick Alderton came. Mr. Harcastle sent a note that arrived the morning of, which said, "Congratulations. The quarterly reports will presumably continue?" Ilara wrote back, "Yes. And they will continue to be excellent." It was late November, 2 years exactly from the first night Callum had walked into the stable with a lamp, when she sat at the desk in the estate office in the early morning before the house woke up. Her ledger open. The quarterly figures nearly finished. Tea gone cold because it always went cold when she was working. The window faced the stable yard. Frost on the cobblestones. The 3rd stall window dark in the early light. A single stable lad crossing with a bucket, breath clouding in the cold. She looked at it for a moment. Then she heard his footsteps in the corridor, unhurried, familiar, the particular rhythm she could have identified in a crowded room by now, and the door opened. He leaned in the doorway, still half-dressed, his hair not yet arranged, looking at her with the expression that meant he had come to find her and was not surprised to find her here. "You're up early," he said. "Quarterly numbers," she said. "They're good. Are you surprised?" "Never," she said. He came in. Sat in the chair across from her. Picked up her cold tea and looked at it. "You haven't touched this." "I was going to." "You weren't." "I was thinking about it." He set it down. He looked at the stable yard through the window. She looked at him looking at it. 2 years. An east wing being slowly rebuilt. A debt cleared in 22 months. A deed corrected in parliamentary record. A ledger on a desk that had once been borrowed and was now, unmistakably, hers. "The North Field," she said. "The new manager thinks we could try a different rotation next season." "Does he?" "I think he's right. I've been looking at the yield projections and—" "Ilara," he said. She looked up. He was looking at her across the desk, across the quarterly figures, across 2 years of problems solved and one very large one built, the kind that was not a problem at all but was, in every way that mattered, the opposite. The numbers, he said, will still be there in an hour. She looked at him. Then she closed the ledger. Outside, the frost was beginning to lift from the cobblestones, the pale December sun finding the stable yard and turning it, briefly, gold. Somewhere in the house, a fire was being laid. The day was beginning, ordinary and specific and entirely theirs. She pushed back her chair and stood up. 1 hour, she said. 1 hour, he agreed. She walked around the desk. He stood up to meet her. The numbers, of course, would still be there. They always were. But so, now, was everything else. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.